First of all, I want to say that I'm very glad and delighted, very thankful to the committee, to organization for inviting me to take part at this conference with a very exciting and fascinating topic. So I will be reading about a topic that has fascinated me for years, and it is the question of superstition and specifically the way Plutarch of Chaeronea perceived that topic. So in the vast collection of Plutarch's essays on various topics known as Etica in Greek and Moralia in Latin, one finds a small group of writings specifically dedicated to religious topics. In these writings, the author from Chaeronea presented his religious philosophical views on some of the most pressing cultural issues of his time, such as the decline of Greek oracles, which were visited less and less in Plutarch's time and whose prophecies were increasingly disbelieved. This group of writings includes the so-called Pythian dialogues, several of them, the dialogue on the daemonion of Socrates, as well as the essay on superstition, to mention just a few most important ones. I like to think of Plutarch as a proto-anthropologist, among other things, a forerunner of the anthropology of religion. As a priest of the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, as well as an initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries, Plutarch directly witnessed the religious life of his time and took part in it. His need to observe and critically examine the religious phenomena of his era, as well as to leave a written record of them, provided him with a dual position as both an observer and a participant. In this blend of the so-called emic and etic positions, as it is known as anthropology, he was very interested in the crisis faced by the old Hellenic religion to which he himself belonged. That crisis manifested in various ways, through the spread of atheism, or what he perceived as atheism, meaning mostly Epicureanism, the loss of faith in the oracles of the old gods, the prominence of folk magic, folk religion, call it whatever you like, and last but not least, the emergence of a powerful new religion, Christianity. In an effort to understand the significant changes that have affected the world of traditional Greek spirituality of his day, Plutarch devoted much attention to the question of what constitutes authentic piety as opposed to various deviations. One of the most widespread deviations was what Plutarch, and not only him, termed deisidaimonia, meaning superstition, which he analyzed in an essay titled Peri Deisidaionias, On Superstition, and in this paper I examine what Plutarch meant or could have meant by that term and how, in his view, superstition related to the so-called authentic piety. The essay on superstition is somewhat an unusual text for Plutarch. It is characterized by a more personal tone, a pronounced emotional charge, and even intolerance, which are not typical for the always temperate and scholarly detached writer from Chaeronea. This has led some scholars to consider it spurious, while Frank Cole Babbitt, Plutarch's English translator, suggested that it could have been a draft for a speech, in which case it would be characterized by a great degree of personal involvement. Today, almost no one doubts that the treatise on superstition is indeed Plutarch's. Moreover, considering the context of the treatise, as well as Plutarch's intellectual background, the more personal tone becomes quite understandable. In fact, I will attempt to show that with his essay on superstition, Plutarch actually took part in a sort of culture war that was raging at the time. I will argue that his views on superstition must be taken in the broader context of the late antique religious market, let's call it that way, and the diversification of religious options, not to say offers. Plutarch's conservative and at times even intolerant attitude in the essay ought to be understood in the context of a major shift of religious paradigms that was carried over from the Hellenistic syncretism to the Roman era. Plutarch's essay is not an examination of superstition alone. Rather, it is a comparison or syncresis, as it was called in Greek rhetoric, of superstition and atheism, or atheotes, as he calls it. Plutarch views these two as extremes on a spectrum, with true piety, or eusebeia as he calls it, occupying the middle ground. Atheism and superstition both arise from ignorance about the true nature of the gods. However, superstition is worse and more dangerous because it is wrong judgment compounded with emotions, mostly fear, whereas atheism is merely wrong judgment with no emotion attached. As an atheist remains composed in his or her ignorance, not falling into harmful, irrational states. Plutarch uses the word allogistos for irrational. On the other hand, the delusion of superstition is more dangerous as it involves the creation of various affective states, or pathie, as he calls it, and not only him, as we know from Plutarch's other writings, and these are the greatest enemies of the soul. In a superstitious person, they manifest as a web of negative emotions, a state of constant anxiety, and even a kind of obsession, which shackles the soul and keeps her in a state of hopelessness and helplessness. The tragic paradox of superstitious people is that they believe in the gods, but in the wrong way. They are a kind of inverted believers. Their belief that the gods wish to harm them leads them to passivity and defeatism. In other words, superstition is the mistaken idea that the gods cause pain or harm, a false idea that provokes unnecessary fear. Thus, what we find in Plutarch's essay is above all a stunning psychological analysis of what he saw as a superstitious person. But what does Plutarch mean by superstition? Given his twofold position as a participant and a judge, so to speak, it is of crucial importance to examine the cultural, literary, and historical context of his assessments. We may commit the mistake of projecting our own modern understanding of superstition onto Plutarch and antiquity as a whole. As Dale Martin rightly points out, the modern notions of superstition are parasitic on whatever is taken to be scientific. In other words, quote, superstitions are beliefs and practices that presuppose a faulty understanding about cause and effect, usually by assuming notions of causality that have been rejected by modern science, end quote. In other words, superstition in our time is the other to science. The problem with this approach is that we can label as superstitious anything we see in ancient culture that looks superstitious by modern standards, including, of course, Plutarch himself. Instead, we should try to understand this notion on Plutarch's own terms. So let us first see in what ways he speaks of superstitious people, their behavior, habits, and convictions. From the way Plutarch describes them, we can conclude that he drew his examples from two types of sources. From literary tradition, which is, of course, a standard component of his style and approach, but also from personal observation. As befits a defender of traditional ancestral religion, who was in line with other ancient critics of myth, such as Xenophon and Heraclitus, Plutarch attacks the anthropomorphism of the gods and their myths because they instill irrational fear of gods into people's minds. For instance, he particularly criticizes those aspects of the myth of Artemis that involve the offering of human sacrifices and portray the goddess as a savage, sinister companion of the chthonic mistress Hecate. Take, for instance, the story of Iphigenia. With equal ferocity, Plutarch opposes the myth that attributes cruelty to Lethe, the mother of the divine twins Apollo and Artemis. He does not believe that the goddess could have ordered her son and daughter to kill the queen Niobe just because of her boastful nature. They think nothing differently of Apollo, Hera, or Aphrodite, notes Plutarch bitterly, referring to superstitious people. They fear and dread them all, end quote. Just in passing, this criticism of people who misunderstand the myth is directly related to Plutarch's ideas about desirable and undesirable types of education, on which he elaborated in his essay, How to Study Poetry, where he took up Plato's criticism of poets who corrupt the young by presenting a wrong image of the gods. Echoes of that criticism are strongly present in the essay on superstition as well. The most obvious literary source for Plutarch is certainly Theophrastus, with his book Character Sketches et Hoi Characteres. As the 16th example in his brief outline of moral types, Theophrastus presents the superstitious man of his time, ho deisi daimon, as he calls him, a man obsessed with ritual purity, who walks around with a laurel leaf in his mouth, compulsively washes his hands and sprinkles himself with water from holy springs, who invokes the name of the goddess Athena as soon as he hears the hoot of an owl, etc. Plutarch takes a number of examples of such behavior from Theophrastus, or at least his examples closely resemble those of Aristotle's student, such as when he describes people smearing with mud, wallowing in filth, casting oneself down with face to the ground, etc. In truth, Theophrastus's treatment of superstition is much simpler than Plutarch's, almost at the level of parody. It appears that Theophrastus was largely concerned with the social consequences of superstition. It simply incites shameful behavior inappropriate for an Athenian citizen. However, he is very important in the formation of the Greek philosophical notions of superstition for two reasons. First, as far as we know, he was the first philosopher to use the word deidaimonia as a term of reproach in the context of superstition, a question to which I will return. And second, he was the first to interpret superstition as a kind of excessiveness. For him, the superstitious person is someone who is excessive in their observation of ritual piety, as well as someone who pays too much attention to signs and omens. In other words, superstition is the too much extreme, of which impiety and atheism are too little. What we find at the core of such understanding thus is the Aristotelian notion of balance or the mean, mesotes, which Plutarch, following Theophrastus, inherited and fully employed in his interpretation of piety and its deviations. Even more interesting in Plutarch's is Plutarch's second type of sources, namely his personal observation, although it is very difficult to make a clear-cut distinction between these two types of sources. But undoubtedly based on the insights of Apollo's priest, who, as we know, traveled extensively and was in active communication with people from different parts of the world, Plutarch sketches a portrait of a man lost in a much bigger world than that of Theophrastus, where the grip of traditional religion has long since weakened. A man who was always in fear of the all-powerful goddess Tyche, who dreaded the bloodthirsty goddesses Hecate and Artemis, as well as their oriental counterparts, the Egyptian Isis and the Syrian Babylonian Ereshkigal, who was the ruler of the underworld. Plutarch strongly disapproves of the fact that these people sought protection from their fears in magical practices and from wandering sorcerers and wizards. He calls them agyrtai and goetes, who could be found in every town and village of the Roman Empire. Here we might recall that Theophrastus too mentions the so-called exegetes, this is how the term has come to be, exegetai, persons who interpret dreams and omens, and who were sought by superstitious people for help and guidance. It is striking that the forms of superstitious man's behavior that Plutarch depicts are very similar to the actual practices described in the Greek magical papyri of the time. Falling prostrate on the ground, rolling in the mud, invoking strange barbaric names or nomina barbara, using sea water, all these appear abundantly in the magical papyri found in Egypt. In other words, much of what Plutarch calls superstition actually comes from the so-called barbaric practices imported by credulous Greeks. It is an importation of foreign ways into more pristine and honorable Greek culture and religion. To a large extent, thus, the essay on superstition can be read as a treatise against magic, as a rival spiritual current of the time, written by a conservative Apollonian priest concerned about the decreasing number of followers. The intellectual context in which Plutarch writes is easier to understand if we take into account what Fritz Graf calls the theological turn in late antique philosophy. In brief, and with a bit of simplification, it could be characterized as the blurring of boundaries between philosophy, religion, and magic, resulting from the great Hellenistic syncretism, as we witness, for instance, in some forms of Neoplatonism, take Iamblic and his notion of theurgy. The flourishing of Middle Eastern and Egyptian mystery cults in the Roman Empire, such as those of Isis and Mithras, the rise of Christianity, the appearance of Hermetic literature, the development of magical and astrological teachings, philosophical and religious demonology, all this gradually led to radical changes in religious paradigms of the epoch, with more innovations that Plutarch was ready to accept. Therefore, it is very striking that Plutarch does not say a word about Christians. We're talking about a period in which both Greek and Roman authors polemically discussed the spread of Christianity, precisely in the context and imagery of superstition and the abandonment of ancestral religion. Writing about the Christian community in his province, for instance, Pliny the Younger calls Christianity a contagious superstition, contagio superstitionis, and interestingly enough, blames it for the fact that some temples have become almost deserted and religious festivals neglected, an argument very similar to Plutarch's in his criticism of those who reject their traditional religion. In his Annals, Tacitus calls Christianity a destructive superstition, exitiabilis superstitio, a disease that invaded Rome from Judea. When praising Nero, Suetonius uses the same labels for Christians. He says that they're a kind of human in the grip of new and maleficent superstitio. We find the same accusations in Lucian of Samosata, who calls the Christians wretched creatures, kakodaimones, who deny the gods of Greece. Certainly the Christians of Plutarch's time were on their way to becoming the main rivals of the Olympian gods on the so-called religious market. Thus it seems impossible that Plutarch, with his keen interest in religion and cults, would not have learned at least something about Christianity, especially as he shared some friends in Rome with Pliny and Tacitus. Unfortunately, I cannot go any further, as this interesting question remains outside the scope of my paper. Let me instead return to the element of fear in Plutarch's definition of superstition. It is contained in the very term deisiddaimonia, which he rightly interprets as fear of gods. More precisely, it means fear of demons, with the oldest, most general meaning of daimon being simply divine force. It could variably refer to gods, heroes, the souls of the deceased, different supernatural forces, positive, negative, or simply neutral. The topic does not allow me to digress into Plutarch's notions of demons, which partly move away from the traditional Platonic idea of demons as some sort of semi-divine beings and intermediaries. It is more important to consider the implications of fear in Plutarch's overall understanding of piety and religion. First of all, the term itself is ambiguous and can be misleading. Both halves of the term can have a range of meanings, as I just mentioned in the case of the word daimon. And the first part, deisi, coming from the verb deido, which means to be afraid, can also refer to awe or respect rather than actual fear. In other words, deisiddaimonia can have a neutral or even positive meaning, synonymous with the words such as eusebeia or theosebeia. We find such usage in Xenophon of Athens in his Agesilaus and Cyropedia. We find it in Aristotle too, who in his Politics says that a good ruler should be deisiddaimon, respectful of the gods. We still find it even much later, for instance, in Diodorus Siculus from the 1st century BC, which proves that throughout the centuries the word retained its neutral and positive meanings too. However, Plutarch aligns himself with Theophrastus and interprets the term as referring to irrational, delusional fear of the divine. What is at stake here is the nature of the world itself. And this is actually the underlying philosophical rationale of the whole idea of fear as the main component of superstition. If the gods can do harm on purpose, if they can be angry, vengeful, and malicious so as to be feared, it means that the cosmos itself is not divine, harmonious, and good, as Plato teaches, for instance, in the Republic and Timaeus. This is an argument from ontological hierarchy identified with ethical hierarchy. If the gods are ontologically superior, they must also be morally superior. Those higher on the ontological scale must be higher on the ethical scale too. Thus we find in the Republic statements like, quote, the gods are necessarily good and can do no evil, or God must be the best of everything, etc. If such is the case, then fearing the gods reveals a wrong theology, so to speak. It points to a deeply flawed understanding of the world. Superstition simply points to a less than perfect world, and for Plutarch this means plain impiety. This is why for him superstition is worse than atheism. In a way, at least typologically, if not historically, we could compare it to the traditional Christian notion of heresy. To sum up, Plutarch's criticism of superstition is multi-layered, and mostly based on his Platonic philosophical orientation, as well on his personal position as Apollo's priest at Delphi. It was written at a time when the old Greek religion, as he understood it, was in a steady decline in an atmosphere of flourishing rival spiritual currents and teachings. In addition to his priestly conservatism and efforts to reject religious innovations, Plutarch adheres to the Platonic teaching of the goodness and perfection of the world, a notion that would be disrupted by the existence of malevolent gods. Finally, in his evaluation of superstition, he relies on the philosophical tradition of measure and balance. These should exist in everything, including religious life. Neither too much nor too little piety is good. But what exactly the right measure is, the answer must be sought elsewhere in Plutarch's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noel, for a wonderful talk, informative, and it's very unfortunate that we don't give a talk right after you, because we are going to mention diamonds and ontological and moral order, and Martin is a wonderful author that you also cited. But beside that, more about diamonds tomorrow. But here is the question. According to Plutarch, would you say that superstition can work? Because if you read Desert Fathers and if you read Desert Fathers of the 6th century, John and Barsanuphius, that I read the most, Evagrius is the other one that I read. But for them, the thing is that superstition can work, but it's bad for your soul. So it's like it will harm you, but it can work. And now I'm wondering if, I don't know, covering yourself with the mud or doing these ridiculous things can actually protect you, or it's a foolish belief. It doesn't work.
Well, I can respond with a counter question. What is it that you hope to achieve by superstition? I mean,
well, to protect yourself, to heal yourself, those things, right? Like people do it to not to get sick, or to recover from sickness, or to get a job, or not to lose the job, or like, you know, those things. For John and Barsanuphius, these are causal powers that exist out there. You call the demon, and demon helps you out. It harms your soul, but it gets you healed. Or you predicts things for you. So it can kind of work in a real way, even though it's bad for you. So it's not, okay. Anyway.
He doesn't say anything about achieving the desired result. And I don't think he would say it even if he believed it, because it would be an advertisement for superstition. Okay. But he does believe that superstition is a real psychological power that has a very real consequences on those who are affected by it. But he simply says that these consequences are bad. That he doesn't say anything positive about it in the way that you imply.
Yeah.
Definitely
okay.
no.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Maybe will be confusing, but the most interesting part of your presentation for me was the part of about fear. And about fear. And you mentioned at the beginning, I think, education? No? Education. Yeah. Okay. So we have irrational fear of gods. I think fear of gods is not irrational. If there is an opportunity for God to scorch us, then it's rational to fear God. But in educational sense, I suppose I would like to know a bit more about his view on education. Like, is that something like paideia? And if we learn young people to not about the real nature of gods, we would not have irrational fear of God. So we would be free of fear in that sense. So he was thinking about God, that God is like, his nature is that he would not hurt us, even if we are bad. So I would like to hear something more about his view on God, would he hurt us if we are bad, and something about educating young people about fear of gods. Maybe, sorry.
Great question. Let me just get back to the first part of your question. Actually, it's very interesting because this whole idea is about trying to eliminate the idea, the notion of God's capacity to harm us. Okay. So it goes back to Plato's idea of the demiurge who creates the best possible world, which is the most beautiful world, the good world, etc. I think that it could be seen as a kind of utopian philosophical project of trying to sanitize and tame an uncontrollable, insufficiently known, whimsical, and terrifying world. Because I think it's safe to say that all ancient cultures had an image of the world as a dangerous place and of gods as dangerous entities who could harm us, as they wish, whether we did something bad or not. So this idea was actually an attempt to somehow contain this ancient fear, which I agree with you totally is rational. It's a rational fear because we don't know what will happen the next moment. And it ultimately failed, as we can see in late antiquity, with Neoplatonists, with bad demons coming into the picture, etc. As for education, Plutarch, this essay that I mentioned, How to Study Poetry, it's totally based on Plato's Republic, and that you should not spoil the children by telling them those horrible stories about gods who mutilate each other, etc., because it actually creates the wrong image of the divine realm. So basically, you should purge the curricula, to put it that way, and teach them only those things that uplift virtue, etc. What else I wanted to say about this was that, it skipped my mind now. Yes, the Plutarch's concept of God, you can read about it in Pythian dialogues, especially on the letter E at Delphi, also on the decline of oracles, etc. He's on the way of, in the process of turning Apollo into a monotheistic divinity, I would put it that way. And in a sense, he writes about God as a transcendent being that very much looks like the Christian God, and makes a distance. He's very angry with identifying Apollo with the sun, for instance. It pisses him off. He says, Apollo cannot be the sun, the God, Apollo, he is transcendent, he is, that's how he interprets this letter E, as you are, A. So it confirms his ontological absolute status.
Thank you for a great talk, just a short one. It's a question of formulations. Can anywhere in the text be found a formulation of definition of superstition as a fear of supernatural or like a fear of metaphysical? And I guess that the second part of the question is that can there be found a definition of superstition as a fear of unknown? I guess not, but this is my personal favorite definition, so that's why I'm asking.
Well, as for your first question, it's a problematic one because I don't really think that the concept of supernatural as such even existed in Plutarch's time. We're talking about, a later development. Back to Plato and Aristotle, it was all part of one nature. So you don't have this ontological gap. That's my impression, concerning Plutarch. As for the other question, the fear of unknown, yes, that's something that's going on through the text, but he interprets this in a psychological way. It's natural to be afraid of the unknown, but you should not project it to the realm of gods.
Before closing this, I would like to just address only one remark and question about this. It is historical from the point of view of cultural history, maybe, because you mentioned that there is some similarities between practices that described by Plutarch and in pipery, magic pipery in Egypt. Yeah. But I'm not quite sure, because if I understood well, this thesis is some practices maybe import from Egypt in this time, because at that time, beginning of the Roman Empire, and thus it was widespread throughout the empire. But my impression is a little different, because if you read Theophrastus, at the beginning of Hellenistic time, or the end of classical time, in every single sentence he described different kind of superstitions. You have some magical practices. So I'm not sure, and even having in mind what the classical book of Dots about Greek, irrational Greek. So we have that maybe this magic element was present in Greek culture, not from classical, but always. You know, and I'm not. We often say that it must be import from the East also, because we usually see Greeks through. As philosophical.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with you. Magic has been there always. I'm not talking about importing magic from Egypt. What was imported was Middle Eastern type of magic. You didn't have small figures of Isis and Ereshkigal and other Middle Eastern Egyptian deities. You didn't have Nomina Barbara in Theophrastus' time. You understand? So what changed was the content of magic, but magic existed always in Greece as well. I mean, yeah, definitely agree with you. Thank you. Thank you.